Hi, this is Karina Barquet from Stockholm Environment Institute. Today I will be presenting RISC-KIT's fifth tool, the multi-criteria assessment. First, some background on DRR approaches to hazards and how these have come to shape the type of solutions advocated. Traditionally, research into environmental hazards was mainly undertaken by those in physical sciences and engineering disciplines, for instance, geomorphology or hydrology. Emphasis was often placed on the development and application of engineering solutions. In the case of flood management, this centered on controlling flood waters through the use of technical solutions. But for the past 50 years, research in disaster risk reduction has increasingly highlighted the need to take social, economic, and political dimensions into account. An attempt to do this was through the so-called hazard paradigm, which emphasized how people's perceptions shape their response to hazards. According to this paradigm, societies with low risk perception were assumed to adjust poorly to hazards, while those with higher risk perception were assumed to adapt better and behave in an anticipatory way. The consequence of this paradigm was an emphasis on technical and structural solutions to deal with disasters that continue to be seen as a result of natural processes instead of considering how risk might be constrained by the wider historical and social dimensions of the hazard that individuals are often not able to control. There was a need to broaden this hazard-focused approach to include analysis of other characteristics like economic and political forces that shape how exposed populations may negatively affected by a particular hazard. This approach highlights how disasters are largely due to socioeconomic vulnerability rather than inevitable natural factors, which have disproportionate impacts on certain populations who have limited access to resources in order to be able to mitigate or respond to hazards. An example of this is the case of Hurricane Katrina, where certain groups such as the poor, the African American, the elderly, or residents without their own means of transport were trapped in New Orleans during the flood. With this context in mind, the multi-criteria assessment developed in RISC-KIT aimed at involving a broad group of actors that might be directly or indirectly affected by coastal hazards, in order to increase understanding of vulnerability from different perspectives, to contextualize research findings of relevance to everyday realities, to achieve a combined approach of top-down with bottom-up vulnerability considerations, and to increase local ownership of the project results and foster open dialogue amongst members of civil society in each of the RISC-KIT cases. Generally, MCAs are often carried out with the purpose of evaluating different options against relevant criteria, to increase structure and transparency of a particular process, to display the criteria that are important to consider in a decision, to display alternative outcomes of the various criteria. In RISC-KIT, the purpose of the MCA is to support the interaction and communication process between researchers and local stakeholders, rather than to achieve a particular outcome or take a decision over a particular issue. So, since the focus is on the process rather than the outcome itself, the MCA tool in RISC-KIT was designed to facilitate discussion rather than reaching a decision, to understand applicability and local relevance of the identified measures, to highlight local conditions within the case studies, to underline difference in perceptions across case studies, to contextualize model results, and to understand people's view on the importance of pre-selected criteria. One important aspect when carrying out participatory approaches is the selection of actors that will be involved, because that will determine the outcome and kind of responses obtained. We refer to these actors as stakeholders, which are groups or representatives of these groups of people that are directly or indirectly affected by a coastal hazard or who can affect decision-making or opinion-building. The project identified 9 key stakeholder groups that were broadly defined according to this table. For the MCA, each of RISC-KIT's 10 case studies would aim to have at least one representative from each of the groups. So what was the purpose of this exercise? While RISC-KIT's 4 other tools tested the history of hazards, the hotspots at risk in each of the case studies, and the effectiveness of the selected measures in mitigating hazards, the MCA assessed criteria related to social, economic, and environmental factors that cannot easily be modeled. Stakeholder inclusion is necessary in this case because these are factors that are likely to be perceived differently by different groups in society, and their implementation will face either support or opposition from these groups. Thus, stakeholders would participate in a one-time session to assess the measures previously tested through RISC-KIT's 4 other tools in relation to 3 pre-identified criteria: feasibility, acceptability, and sustainability. Because the focus of this MCA was on the process and not on the results, there was great focus placed on making the process of the MCA interactive and its facilitation dynamic through the use of tangible materials like illustrations, post-its, colors, and by creating a game-like atmosphere. In this slide you see an image of an interactive web viewer that could be used to show the impact of hazards and the effect of measures. You also see examples of cards that were the size of a hand and which each stakeholder received at the beginning of the MCA session. These cards contain basic information on the results of the effectiveness of individual and combined measures in each of the cases that stakeholders could use as a point of departure to then assess the other 3 criteria in the MCA. This assessment would follow these 5 steps that I will now go through. As part of the first step, stakeholders would get introduced to the cards and become familiar with them, compare results between measures and the pre-prepared results of potential combinations of measures, which we here refer to as strategic alternatives, and compare the impact of these measures against the 0 alternative, which is no measure at all. Thereafter, stakeholders would individually select their preferred measures or strategic alternatives, or even have the option of forming new strategic alternatives by finding other possible combinations of measures than the ones initially prepared. Here you see how different cases chose to present information differently based on the same template. The group would then rank the different alternatives and agree on a maximum of 4 to 5 strategic alternatives to be further assessed in the MCA. On step 2, stakeholders would individually score the selected strategic alternatives in relation to the criteria by first assigning a value ranging between -2 and +2 to each criterion per strategic alternative on an individual basis. For instance, how feasible, sustainable, acceptable are sand dunes as a measure to prevent coastal erosion in your area? Once stakeholders had assigned all scores, they used colored post-its with pre-assigned values matching the colors in the template of -2 to +2 scale to write their individual scores once again, but this time make them public to the other stakeholders by pasting them in an MCA flip chart visible to all. Once all scores were visible, stakeholders could engage in a facilitated discussion and agree on 1 score per criteria. In those cases where consensus could not be reached, individual scores were instead averaged. To indicate criteria's importance relative to the objective of the process, for instance, what criterion is most important to consider if sand dunes were to be implemented to reduce coastal erosion, we followed 2 main steps. First, stakeholders were handed out 8 stickers which needed to be distributed on an individual basis in between the 3 criteria to indicate their importance. The more stickers a criterion received, the heavier its weights. Second, each participant indicated the individual weights on the MCA flip chart so that they would be visible to the group. Thereafter, the group engaged in a facilitated discussion to agree on one weight per criteria. Equal weights could be given to more than one criterion. However, it is common in MCA to give different weights to different options, reflecting their importance in the overall objectives. In those cases where consensus was not reached, weights were averaged. Criteria were only weighted once, as it is assumed that their importance is constant across all measures. Next step is to calculate weighted scores of criteria for each measure by multiplying scores times the weight for each criteria for all measures. Lastly, generate sums per measure by adding the weighted scores for all criteria per measures and entering the total value in the row titled Sums at the end of the MCA matrix. The measure with the highest weighted scores was stakeholders' preferred alternative. Thank you and bye.